Welcome back to the Byte Pod, where we explore the real-world challenges and innovations shaping global trade, compliance, and risk management. I'm your host, Anne Riitho. Today, we're zeroing in on what technology startups need to know to avoid costly mistakes when it comes to export controls, sanctions, and supply chain risk. With enforcement ramping up and regulatory landscape shifting quickly, early-stage companies can't afford to treat compliance as an afterthought. With me today, we have, of course, my co-host, Thariq Kara, co-founder and Byte, and longtime expert in regulatory technology and data analytics. Welcome, Thariq.
Hey, everyone. Super excited for this episode.
And then we have our very special guest, Ruta Riley, who's the founder and managing partner at One Lex Partners. She's an international trade attorney with over 17 years of experience helping multinationals and startups navigate complexities of global trade compliance. She's led in-house programs at Lyft, Teledyne Defense, and E&J Gallo Winery, and brings a deep understanding of the legal, operational, and strategic sides of compliance. Ruta, we're so excited to have you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, as I said, we're going to be doing a practical overview and hopefully get some good information for startups. So, just starting at the very high level, Ruta, can you walk us through, I think a lot of people are wondering what actually constitutes an export according to US regulations?
So thanks again for having me. I think it was a great idea that you suggested to really do a primer for tech startups. It's not necessarily limited to tech, but just startup companies. And what we're trying to focus today is really on the essentials, right? Of what do you really have to do? What do you must do? And first and foremost is what is really regulated. And by regulations, we mean, what does U.S. government try to control in terms of like what goods, what services, software, and so on and so forth. And we start with a concept of export, right? So an export is not really just hardware that you can sort of export out of the country in a shipment, right? It also concerns technology, meaning any technical data, engineering drawings, things like that. It concerns software such as source code. It concerns components and everything like that. And any kind of cross-border release, really constitutes an export. In addition, the United States has this interesting concept called a deemed export. So if you release certain technical information to a foreign national in the United States, it's also considered an export deemed to have occurred to the country of the nationality of the recipient. So if we are, we're in Chicago and I'm a German national and you and, show me some kind of a technical drawing of, or share with me or send me an email of a source code, that's considered an export. And you may need a license or a license authorization or an exception to release it to me, okay? So that's what they are. I think important to note, so it can be, like we said, it can be hardware, it can be a visual. If you show somebody a drawing, that's an export. If you send somebody an email, if you grant somebody access, let's say Thariq sits in France and we grant him access to a network and he can see source code that he can use. That's also an export. So all of these things consider an export, and you have to think that all of these flows can be regulated.
That's a great overview. And I think something that's interesting, you bring up the deemed exports, and especially with AI and microchips and microprocessors these days, there's just so much importance in kind of that proprietary knowledge and keeping it safe.
A good rule that was helpful to me when I was starting out, in terms of what do you think is controlled, and really everybody within your organization should be aware of trade compliance, not necessarily be an expert, but just be aware. So anything that you wouldn't want to share with your competitor is usually export controlled, right? So that's just a good rule, sort of like if you don't want to disclose it, that's usually export controlled. And at the start, we have to, what are export controls and sanctions and all of these restrictions? They are really, there are rules in place that the United States government and other governments globally have in place for foreign policy, national security reasons, and sometimes economic policy reasons, right? So anything you wouldn't want to share will likely be controlled.
That's a great tip. Starting us off strong. I've never heard it described that way, so I do think that's like really helpful, practical advice. Because as you were going, it is so complicated. There's a lot that goes into it, as you just explained. Are there certain regulations that people should be, and particularly for this audience, startups should be looking at when they start to look at their exports?
So we will be talking, a little bit about AI and chips and whatnot, because it really has become a world of its own. But this is really a great starting point as to, which government's regulations do you fall under, right? So for export controls and cross-country dealings in technology world, mostly, you're gonna fall either under State Department regulations, which is International Traffic in Arms regulations, which controls military goods. So if you have some kind of technology that maybe has never got demilitarized, or if you have purely military technology, such as, I don't know, Apache helicopter, right? Or something like that, or a chip specifically designed for maybe like a B-2 fighter, right? That will be military goods. And everything that is not military will fall into so-called Export Administration Regulations, EAR, right? And these fall under this Commerce Department, Bureau of Industry and Security Administration, right? And these are goods that are dual use, goods that have commercial use as well as military applications. So a lot of supercomputing powers, AI, things like that. Encryption technology will fall under this dual use regulations. Whenever you deal with regulations, and especially in cross-border controls, you will often, there will be an overlap with OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Controls. OFAC, the most known example of OFAC controls is Cuba embargo, and that we cannot import Cuban cigars, right?
Yeah.
So that's how it is. But OFAC regulates, it's a strict sanctions regulator, right? So you have countries that are completely embargoed, like I mentioned, North Korea or Cuba, and then you have countries that are significantly sanctioned, such as Russia or Iran, and things like that. Of course, this is not limited. OFAC sanctions are not limited to country sanctions that will sanctions certain entities and individuals, like for example Russian oligarchs, right? And significantly banks, because if you are dealing with an entity or an individual cross-border, especially, right, you will always have to consider, okay, is the entity prohibited? Can I engage with this party? Can I enter an agreement? Can I sell to them? Can I buy to them, right? And then really, who is processing your payment? Who is receiving good goods? Who is shipping your goods? So everything from cradle to grave you have to consider in the transaction. Are you allowed to deal with these parties? And naturally, we come to the question is, how do you know, are you allowed to deal with, right? So there is no, so we will say this, that United States has a number, I don't know what's the number now, maybe 47, around 50 government agencies, right? And every government agency, in addition to state and federal government, will have a denied party list. And there is no requirement, there is no legal requirement as such to screen all of your entities and counterparties and your employees, but there is a requirement to not engage with blocked parties. What does that mean to you? Is that the only way to really comply with it is to screen parties. And that this is where the screening platforms such as your platform comes in for knowing who you are dealing with. And this is really part of the basic essential due diligence. And then in addition to parties and things like that, you also want to always ensure that your partner is not owned by a prohibited party, right? So there's always a control and ownership element there. So I think from this long speech, what you really need to know is that there are 3 government regulations that are primarily applicable to you: ITAR for military goods, EAR for dual-use commercial goods, and OFAC, which overlaps with all of the cross-border transaction in terms of payments and things like that, and that you need to screen to know who you are dealing with.
That's a great overview, and obviously, your depth and knowledge in the space, didn't just come from a training or a degree. You've had experience, and you've worked with high-profile tech companies as well. So yeah, just going off on a bit of a tangent, but how did that shape your knowledge? What were some of the challenges?
I would maybe want to focus. I would like to talk a little bit about how maybe enforcement and what we're seeing in terms of work, because I started out in 2008 with a law firm, right? And I started mentioning it now that we're like double digits into the doing this. I noticed how the work has changed, right? Because back in 2008, which by the way was not a good time to graduate law school, right? So back in 2008, a lot of the time we were seeing just the enforcement actions and a lot of like creation of sort of policy manuals and SOPs and things like that, just to sort of do bare minimum. Trade compliance was the last one in everybody's mind, so we were seeing that. Whereas now it seems like everybody knows what a tariff is and what export controls are and what sanctions are, and everybody has heard of somebody and of who got an investigation or maybe a penalty or some kind of a review by the government. And so the work has really changed. I think companies are becoming really, really sophisticated because the transactions are becoming more sophisticated, right? So as the global supply chain is increasing, and so let's talk about some kind of a PCBA example or chip example, right? So to manufacture a PCBA, for example, you will likely be using components maybe from Asia, or you will want to maybe use components from China, and maybe you will want to source steel from somewhere like Russia, right? And so on the import side, you have to think about, okay, what kind of tariffs are you subject, right? So everybody knows about Section 301 tariffs against China, right? Everybody knows, I think, about steel prohibitions from Russian smelters and things like that, right? Forced labor compliance for imports, right? So if you want to bring in components that are manufactured in Xinjiang region, you will have scrutiny as to forced labor compliance, right? And then you have to think, how are you designing it? Are you designing it in the United States? Maybe you're designing it somewhere else, but using US technology, which will subject you to the US controls. All of the design, you have to see, are you subject to controls? Are you subject to US government regulations, right? And then when you try to export, can you export it and what controls apply? Because as you will know, that there's a lot of prohibitions related to the chip exports and chip technology, software and things like that. And certain entities, the most famous being Huawei, you cannot export anything to them, for example, right? So all of these things, I think just supply chain and the regulation context has become really, really complex, and unless you're really sort of like living in that industry and things like that, it's becoming really tough to comply. And you have to do, my sort of cautionary tale from what's being, I think it's most important to do as much as you can from the very beginning. Don't wait until you have, 100 technology products or 100 variations of source code that you have to classify, and maybe you have been releasing and you don't know, you don't know what's what, right? So you want to avoid that position, and you definitely want to avoid dealing with counterparties or business partners that have been like prohibited and you didn't know. One thing is that's very important to know. All of the export control violations as well as sanctions violations are strict liability, meaning you don't have to know that somebody's prohibited or denied party, right? So the fact that you engaged with somebody is automatically a violation. The penalty amounts are really severe. So under OFAC, ITAR, and ITAR, you're talking about if you're in criminal liability zone, it's the penalty amount is up to $1 million and 20 years in prison. So it really, and violation is a single shipment is a violation, so it really adds up quickly, right? I was just reading the enforcement information. I think the latest penalty is something like $250 million for an American VC company having managed a investment by Russian oligarchs. So those add up, and the enforcement is increasing against even startup companies. There's President Trump's administration is really focusing on export controls in certain markets, including China especially, and so you will see more and more of these enforcement actions, even against startups.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And Ruta dealt with my tangent really well and made it, and I always do this to you, and I'm sorry, but
No.
Go ahead, Anne. What's next here?
No, that's great. I feel like getting into those like real world examples is really helpful. And I feel like you were able to walk through the whole process, which is so important. I feel like a lot of times when we talk to companies, there's not necessarily someone focused on export control, right? Or someone focused on import. There are lots of people wearing many hats.
Mm-hmm.
So you were able to tie that together really well, just in terms of what the whole process looks like for a company.
Sure. And we can talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, because you also have to think about your supply chain, right? Where do you want to source, where you do not want to source, how the tariffs may change, just purely from economical perspective. Do you want to be in China, or do you want to maybe shift to somewhere else? Do you want to maybe shift to Europe? So lots of considerations like that. Unfortunately, any sort of supply chain change, vendor change, or anything like that takes a long time to complete, as everybody will know. Yeah, sometimes you see it. I see contracts sometimes that have been in the process of negotiating for 1-2 years, which is a long time, right? So there's a lot of long-term planning involved, and I think the earlier you start, the better it is for the company, or at least you are not so reactionary that you're always fighting a fire.
Yeah.
And I kind of always go back to some of my experiences with ICE and HSI, and how we saw that maybe the top 500 companies in the US, they've got programs, they've got compliance, global trade compliance in there. Below that, there's much less and less as you get smaller. But it's still important with automation and tools coming out. And, that's a big customer base for us, mid-market and small businesses that want to do the right thing, but get priced out.
So I actually want to talk about it a little bit, because, a big company does not necessarily have a state-of-the-art compliance program, right? And because I will say I think the smaller the company or mid-sized companies have an easier time to monitor the compliance, right? And maybe it does not prohibit you to having good controls in place, and it doesn't have to be very sophisticated, the controls, right? So long that you sort of like thought about it and planned it out, and you have, maybe protected yourself by papering the transaction and things like that. And, from you cannot ever shift the export controls responsibility or sanctions responsibility onto the counterparty, but you can protect yourself a little bit. You know, and there is a lot to be said about automation, because I have yet to see the demo of Byte, but I imagine it, you know, allows for automation, and that removes a lot of. There is a lot of things that you can do, I think, with the denied party screening program, in that you can set certain parameters. You can dictate how it's searching and what it's not searching, right? And then you want to think about process. If you get a false match, for example, right? If you get, if the prohibited party maybe is John Doe, and you get John Doe the second, is that you know, what's your clearance process, and how do you, you know, do you escalate to somebody, and who is responsible for clearing your transaction, right? But automation removes a lot of work from you, right? Because truth be said, the more human element you introduce, the higher, I think, room for error, right? Because are you going to get every morning you know, to the office at 8 o'clock and screen the transactions manually and things like that? So ideally, you would want to automate it and have it screened nightly. Let's not forget that all of these regulations and denied party lists can change every day. And so you have a responsibility to really screen every day, right, for any changes. And so I'm a big proponent of automation and automated record keeping and things like that, because you may have to prove, you know, that the party that you dealt with 2 years ago was allowed at the time of your transaction. So automation is a good thing in this regard.
Yeah, and to be fair, the government's automating. The government is
totally
targeting. You know, they're spending money on it. So, you know, keeping up, I think, is paramount right now.
Totally, and I think not to speak against the government, but you know, some of the government systems, for example, I don't know, ACE or something like that, have been a little bit outdated, and everybody has moved towards modernization, including the licensing system. SNAPR has moved to, I think, as of July 1st, right? So there is a move towards that, and I think the current administration is really focusing on sort of like streamlining and efficiency and things like that. So I think we may see more and more of that, maybe a little bit slower than private sector, but I think we're definitely moving toward that direction.
Yeah. No, that's great. You mentioned penalties a little bit, but can you also just at a very kind of high level for businesses walk through briefly, you know, compliance is about more than just penalties, right? Like there's understanding like the context in which it's all happening, how different geopolitical trends can influence enforcement. Can you talk through just a little bit around kind of where we're seeing enforcement trends, and you know what that means for companies? So
enforcement trends are definitely on export controls and sanctions. In terms of markets, I think maybe not in order, but I will say the top ones are China, Russia, Iran, and maybe even Myanmar. And I think other countries such as Venezuela have always been sanctioned, and so you will have the enforcement there. And then in terms of commodities, really semiconductors, supercomputing computing technology, AIs, chips, and always any sort of like military goods, any sensitive technology and things like that. So that really is where the enforcement is, I would say. That is not to say that these are the only enforcement areas. You know, if you have a violation, you have a violation. I think I would suggest that maybe I wouldn't sort of like hope, okay, I'm manufacturing light bulbs and therefore there is no enforcement in my area. Yes, maybe the enforcement is a little bit smaller, or sometimes we'll hear, well, how would they know I'm a small company? How would the government know about me? Like, why can't they do that? And we see, maybe that's a better question for Thariq, right? Like, how does the government know? But it seems like they know and they find out, right? So I think there are various algorithms. I think there is actually an increasing reporting, as in the government is inviting actually folks to report the transaction, any kind of violations, and so the mechanisms are in place, and I think it really goes back to yes, if you're dealing with in certain sensitive markets, your exposure is higher, and if you're dealing in any kind of sensitive goods, your exposure is higher. But I wouldn't say that it's just limited to those areas, really.
Yeah, no, that's really insightful. And yeah, I my first job in the government was building an export targeting platform. So,
That's very interesting.
It came out pretty well. But something else I wanted to also kind of one more tangent, if you don't mind here, is, I also feel 100% is that if you get the compliance right, if you start to focus on it and understand it, it actually stops being a cost center. Because if you understand export markets, you can understand where your commodity could potentially go safely as well. And I think that's a big deal for small and mid-market.
So that's a good point. And I want to say something, if you include trade compliance, and because all of this trade compliance, all of the export controls, if you look at what is controlled, it's very, very technical. So in terms when you try to determine is your product controlled, right? Is so if you have a chip, but maybe it's a very simple chip, or maybe it goes above a certain sort of control parameters. It's a sort of like a two-step process, right? It really needs technical personnel such as engineers to review against the regulations. Does your item fall within the scope of regulations? And then you're somebody from trade compliance or legal or somebody like that to review, does it really fall? And do you, most importantly, do you have any exceptions to the licensing? Because one thing that we didn't mention is that, certain exports are outright prohibited, and certain exports are not prohibited, but may require a government license. So you may, seek an export license, for example, from the Bureau of Industry and Security. It will take you maybe, let's say, 8 to 10 weeks, right? And maybe you will be able to export. Talking about the cost center, I think the added benefit of involving trade compliance early is that often you can design yourself out of certain parameters. So if you don't need to be at a certain parameter, right? If there is no added benefit to you, you might as well fall into the lower controls. So certain controls do not apply to you, right? So you can export freely or maybe share freely, right? And what does this compliance give to you? I think business certainty is a big deal. I think it's sort of like not mentioned enough, but at the end of the day, business wants to do business, right? So companies want to sell, they want to ship, they want to expand market and things like that, right? So I think business certainty and knowing what you can do is precisely the point, is that you can do so freely. You can, incorporate timing requirements, because all of the government, export regulations and things like that, and compliance takes a little bit of time. Government permits take a little bit of time, and so you want to sort of like incorporate that into your design process or supply chain and things like that, and it gives you like a big step up in running your business, I think. And for that, you don't need to be either big. And in fact, the smaller you are, I think, or the mid-size you are, like the easier it is to control this,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Oh, perfect.
Yeah. Thank you, Thariq, for your tangents.
They're good tangents.
I feel like they always bring great insight. So
Totally.
Yeah. So I also always want to be mindful on these conversations. We don't need to scare people, right? Like, this is manageable, to your point. Like, if you know it, then you can be successful. So Ruta, in light of all of this, can you walk through like just top action points, or what can people do? What can startups do as they get started to really set themselves up for success with their compliance?
That's a good point. And, I think number one is you have to know whether your product, if you are making a controllable product, and what we mean by controllable, do you need an export license? Few items really are outright banned for exports, right? So you will just need a license, but a lot of the items are not even controlled. So my very basic example of a light bulb or a very basic chip, it may not be controlled, and you can sell it freely, right? And export it freely. One bit that I want to insert is that when we talk about export and deemed exports and things like that, that also, and when we talk about prohibited parties, that involves everybody that you're dealing with. So including your employees and contractors, and can you hire those folks and can you deal with them? So that involves everybody, right? But the smaller you start, if you have 5 SKUs, I mean, that is one thing, is just to classify the product and assess it, versus if you have 200 unclassified SKUs, that can get very, very expensive. And I think with a little bit of training, a big portion of the classification, for example, licensing, export controls licensing and classification, you can do yourself, so long that you have a little bit of training, or at least how to issue spot, right? But so first is know whether your product is controlled or licensable, or does it need any kind of a permission, right? And for that, you will need to classify it and determine, if I want to ship it to Australia, do I need a license? And if I want to ship it to Sweden, do I need a license? And if I want to ship it to Timbuktu, do I need a license, right? So that's number one. Number two is do your due diligence. And by number one in due diligence is know whether you can engage with a business partner. And this is outright. Some partners, for example, on especially designated nationals list on OFAC, you cannot deal with the party at all. You cannot share information. You cannot pay them. You cannot receive money and things like that. And this compliance, due diligence, and things like that is really goes back to the screening of the 9 parties, and screening of everybody in your supply chain, right? Really, the best practice is to screen everybody from your employees, contractors, to definitely business partners. And if one thing let's mention is that if you are operating in several jurisdictions, let's say you have a U.S. company, but you also have maybe a subsidiary in, I don't know, in Switzerland or the EU, you will have multiple jurisdiction regulations apply, and you will have to conduct, if the party is allowed under the US law, is the party allowed under the EU law, for example. And sometimes those regimes closely follow each other, sometimes not so much. So you have to make an assessment there, right? So number one, classify. Number two, conduct due diligence, automate where you can, and establish even like the basic, I think for number three, establish even the basic compliance processes, right? So it doesn't have to be a compliance manual, but start off with like a compliance procedures, and like how to classify, how to license. If you get into some kind of a trouble, who do you call, right? Who, like, is there maybe a government helpline that you can reach out to and seek advice? So things like that, just like, I think just sort of like be aware of where you are, as they say, sort of be aware of your surroundings, and it's really not different. You just want to be aware of your surroundings. Can you go here and, can you cross the red light? Right? So, and if you do cross the red light, is there, like, will somebody give you a fine for it? So I think it's just being aware of where you operate, the industry that you operate, and the controls that apply to you.
That's great. So product classification, due diligence and screening, building a process, including knowing who to call. On that point, Ruta, where do you fit in? Can people call you?
No, I'd be glad if people call me. So we do help companies with classification, with general strategy advice. We try to keep it as practical as possible. We try to balance the government requirement against the, against the business needs. Sort of having been in house, I sort of like I'm sort of, it's drilled into me, that like business still needs to run. So we really assist from start to finish in cross-border transactions. So always welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thariq, did you have any questions or final thoughts?
Yes, an unrelated fun fact. As you know, I grew up in Zimbabwe.
Yes.
And I think it's a well-known truth that the Lyft guys got the idea for the product in Zimbabwe, where they saw people putting their thumb out for a lift. And they thought, well, I can turn that into an application, and they did. So, yeah.
Good for them, Yeah. Good for them. Yeah.
They solved a pressing issue. But no, on a serious note, we really thank you for your time. You're an expert in the space, and it's always a pleasure to have people like you coming on to help industry navigate these complex issues. So thank you for your time, and really appreciate your insights.
Thank you both very much for having me here. Really a pleasure.
Thank you. And to everyone listening, thank you for tuning in to the Byte Pod. If you found today's episode helpful, make sure to subscribe and share with your team or others. And we will be back soon with more insights on trade, compliance, and risk. Thank you, Ruta.
Thank you.